Hi guys, in today's video I'm going to talk about what I call the tip of the conditioning iceberg and why more conditioning for kids who are deconditioned isn't necessarily the answer. So those who've seen my latest Instagram post will see lack of conditioning as the part of the iceberg that is above the water's surface and several other things below it. It's not an exhaustive list, but I'm just going to discuss some of those right now. So firstly, a lack of movement efficiency. If you've never been taught how to run correctly, change direction correctly, or even where to be on a field of play in a given sport and how to read the game, then obviously the game is going to take more out of you. So what might appear like a lack of conditioning is simply that you don't move your body that well, you might not have the appropriate strength to weight ratio in order to do this, or you might never have been taught, for example, how to position your body so you're in a more effective position from which to initiate movement, and so you're basically keeping up with play. So those are some key things. When strength to weight ratio decreases, as it probably has done in most kids who are either sedentary or spend more time playing computer games than simply playing in the park, you're going to find that kids who can't or don't have that strength to body weight ratio, it's more taxing to move their body weight around either a field, a court, or indeed simply going for a run. So you might find you can have some quick wins by simply improving strength to body weight ratio. Again, this is where I think sessions that focus on bodyweight strength and sneaking those exercises in there, even if you're gamifying them, is a great way to improve running economy and the ability for a certain speed of running to tax your body much less than it otherwise normally would do. There's also certain things like psychological resilience, which I personally think is something that kids need to be exposed to in small doses, dare I say. If you're asking a kid who struggles to run to do cross country, you're basically putting them in a position where they're probably going to fail, they're probably going to feel rubbish about it, and it needs to be achievable. Now, because obviously sport at the moment is pretty much locked down, kids still need to be made to be active, and this is where I think stuff like obstacle courses or even creating your own movement type of games is going to bring a lot of benefit. So before we think that more conditioning is the answer, firstly, let's question whether kids are moving well enough, whether kids have appropriate strength to body weight ratios, and whether kids can read a sport or a game well enough to understand where they need to be in time and space. If you do deem that conditioning is appropriate, then let's talk about types. So kids are mainly type 1 muscle fiber, which means that they're built for submaximal efforts and to go all day. As myself and Rob Milner discussed in a recent podcast, there is evidence that kids can benefit physiologically from high intensity interval training. However, my caveat to that would be, and for example on the podcast we mentioned a paper about 9 to 11-year-old swimmers benefiting from working at 92% of their best effort. Now, if you're a child and you've got mainly type 1 muscle fibers, you're mainly suited to those submaximal efforts. Even though 92% is high in relative terms, in absolute terms, it's still pretty low. An interesting paper by Rattel et al., where they looked at 10-second watt-bike sprints for adults and prepubescent children, found that the 10-second effort separated by, I believe it was a minute rest, for kids, the watts on the watt bike, so the power output, basically didn't move from first rep to last rep, whereas adults, obviously, who have developed a more muscle mass, have got a hormonal profile that supports increases in muscle mass, and obviously the more muscle we've got, the stronger we can be, the higher force outputs we can put out, whereas adults, when they had, for example, 60 seconds rest, which is quite short if we're talking full recovery, their power output just dropped off a cliff. So kids are really suited to aerobic activities, so submaximal. So better alternatives than high intensity interval training for kids include refining movement technique, especially when we're talking about jumping, landing, running mechanics, sprinting, raising the ceiling with kids, so getting them stronger as well as more efficient, getting them more powerful, and of course teaching them efficiency, especially if we're talking about something like swimming, in the locomotion patterns in their sport. I'll be talking about this a lot more in detail in my upcoming a youth athlete ebook, and the conditioning chapter is one that I think will turn a lot of heads and will probably go against the grain for what a lot of people think they know about training youth athletes, or indeed when it comes to the kids model versus the adults model. And it explains in detail why kids are not miniature adults, as well as obviously some supporting evidence from the literature and details of other topics discussed in my podcast. Hope you found this useful. Share it if you have done, and I'll catch you again in the next episode.